Welcome back to Coremates. If this is your first time here, take a second to arrive. Not mentally, physically. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. You don't need to be productive while listening to this. You don't need to take notes. You don't need to turn this into self-improvement. This space has never been about fixing yourself. It's about sitting with life as it actually feels and understanding it together without rushing to conclusions. At Coremates, we don't come with answers neatly wrapped in advice. We come with curiosity, with honesty, with conversations that don't pretend we have everything figured out. This podcast exists because so many of us are walking around with questions we don't say out loud, questions about our emotions, our pace, our relationships with ourselves. And instead of turning those questions into problems, we let them breathe. Today's episode is one we've been circling for a long time. Not because it's trendy or because it performs well online, but because it shows up quietly in almost every life. We're talking about anxiety. Not anxiety as a diagnosis. Not anxiety as a label that puts something wrong on you. But anxiety as an experience, one that many people are carrying silently, often without the language to name it. And I think what's important to say right away is that anxiety doesn't always look dramatic. It's not always panic attacks or racing thoughts that knock you over. Sometimes it's just that constant background tension, that feeling that you're always slightly behind your own life, that even when things are fine, your body doesn't fully believe it. Exactly. And that's why we wanted to talk about it this way. Because so many people think if I'm anxious, something must be wrong with me. But often, anxiety is not a flaw, it's a response. A response to pressure, to speed, to uncertainty, to living in a world that rarely lets us feel settled. When you start looking at it like that, anxiety stops feeling like a personal failure and starts making a strange kind of sense. We're not here today as experts. We're not here to diagnose anyone listening. We're here as two women thinking out loud together, sharing observations, research, lived moments, and questions we're still asking ourselves. I'm here as someone who has felt anxiety in different forms across different phases of life. Sometimes loud, sometimes subtle, sometimes disguised as productivity or overthinking. And I'm here as someone who has learned, often the hard way, that anxiety doesn't respond well to force. You can't shame it away. You can't out-discipline it. You can't silence it by telling yourself to calm down. What it responds to is understanding. Slowing down enough to listen to what it's actually trying to say. This isn't an episode about what's wrong with you. It's an episode about what makes sense once you stop blaming yourself and start paying attention. If you're listening to this and thinking, I don't even know if I have anxiety, that's okay. You don't need to identify with a label to be here. If you've ever felt restless without knowing why, tense for no clear reason, overwhelmed by small things, or emotionally tired even when your life looks good on paper, this conversation is for you. And we want to say this gently. Nothing you're feeling disqualifies you from being okay. Anxiety doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're broken. Often, it means you're sensitive to your environment. It means your system is trying to protect you, even if it's doing that in a clumsy or exhausting way. So today, we're going to explore anxiety from multiple angles. We'll talk about where it comes from biologically, psychologically, socially. We'll talk about the different ways it shows up in people's lives. We'll share personal moments, things we've witnessed in friends, patterns we've noticed over time. And we'll also talk about ways of surviving it, not by erasing it, but by learning how to live with more space inside yourself. No pressure to heal. No pressure to transform. Just permission to understand. Think of this episode like sitting at a table with us. Coffee getting cold. Thoughts unfolding slowly. No one interrupting you to tell you how you should feel. Just two people trying to make sense of something that touches almost everyone, whether they talk about it or not. Let's start there. With curiosity. With softness. And with the question that changes everything, not, how do I get rid of this? But what is this trying to tell me about the way I'm living? You know what I keep thinking about lately? How anxiety rarely shows up the way we expect it to. It's not always a panic attack or a racing heart in the middle of the street. Most of the time, it's much quieter than that. It's lying in bed at night, exhausted, knowing your body needs sleep, but your mind just won't land anywhere. Not on a thought, not on rest. Just hovering. Yes, that feeling of being tired but wired. Where nothing is technically wrong, yet nothing feels settled either. The room is quiet, the phone is down, the day is over, and still, your body doesn't seem to get the memo. There's this low-level alertness, like something might happen, even though nothing is happening. Exactly. And sometimes there isn't even a clear thought attached to it. No obvious fear. No story you can point to. Just that background hum. A tight jaw. A shallow breath. A sense that you're bracing for something unnamed. And that's the part that really messes with people, because when you can't explain it, you start doubting yourself. You start telling yourself, maybe I'm just like this. Maybe this is my personality. Maybe I'm too sensitive, too weak, too restless. And because anxiety isn't being dramatic in those moments, it's easy to dismiss it, to minimize it, to keep functioning on top of it. And on the outside, life often looks completely fine. You're showing up. You're doing what needs to be done. You're replying to messages, going to work, meeting friends, making plans. If someone asked you how you're doing, you'd probably say, I'm okay. Not because you're lying, but because there's no obvious crisis to report. That's the paradox, isn't it? Life looks stable, even successful sometimes, while the body feels unsafe. Not in danger, but not at ease either. It's like living with a quiet internal tension that never fully switches off. And because there's no visible cause, people assume it must be their fault. There's also a loneliness in that, because invisible struggles are hard to share. If you're grieving, people understand. If you're sick, there's language for it. But how do you explain, I feel on edge for no clear reason, without sounding ungrateful or dramatic? So most people don't. They carry it privately. And when everyone carries it privately, it starts to feel like you're the only one. Like everyone else has some inner calm you missed out on. But the truth is, so many people are walking around with this same invisible weight, just calling it stress or tiredness or adulthood. I think that's why anxiety has become so normalized that we almost don't see it anymore. We joke about it. We label it lightly. We say things like, that's just life, or everyone's anxious these days. And while that's true, it also hides how much it's costing people internally. Because when anxiety becomes background noise, you stop questioning it. You stop asking what your body might be responding to. You just adapt. You live slightly tense, slightly rushed, slightly disconnected from rest. And over time, that state starts to feel normal, even though it's not neutral. And I think before we even try to explain anxiety, define it, or analyze it, we need to pause here. We need to admit how common this experience has become. How many people are living with this quiet, constant sense of unease without ever naming it as anxiety? Because once you name it, something shifts. Not because it's suddenly solved, but because you're no longer alone with it. You stop thinking, this is just me, and start asking, what is my system responding to? Exactly. And that question opens a very different conversation. One rooted in understanding, not self-blame. So maybe before we explain anxiety, we need to admit how normal it's become. Once you admit how common this feeling is, the next question almost asks itself, what is actually happening inside us? Not morally, not personally, but biologically. Because anxiety isn't a character flaw, it's a system doing something it was designed to do. Yes. And that's the part that already softens the shame. Our bodies were built for survival long before they were built for modern life. Anxiety, at its core, is a protection mechanism. It exists to keep us alive, to detect threat, to prepare us to respond quickly when something might harm us. The problem isn't that the system exists. The problem is that the system hasn't updated. Our nervous system still reacts as if danger is immediate and physical. Like there's a lion in front of us. Heart rate up. Muscles tense. Breath shallow. Attention narrowed. Except now, the lion isn't a predator. It's an unread message. A passive-aggressive tone. A meeting you don't feel ready for. A future that feels unstable. A silence where reassurance used to be. And the body doesn't really care what form the threat takes. It just knows uncertainty. So your body starts preparing you to run, to fight, to survive, but there's nowhere to go. You can't sprint away from an email. You can't physically wrestle uncertainty to the ground. So the energy stays inside you. That's such an important point. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline get released, but they don't complete their cycle. In the past, movement would resolve them, running, fighting, escaping. Now we sit, we scroll, we overthink. The body stays activated without release. Which is why anxiety often feels like restlessness, tightness, buzzing, fatigue at the same time. It's a system stuck on alert in a world that never truly powers down. Even rest gets interrupted by notifications, expectations, comparisons. And psychologically, that constant activation changes how we interpret our inner world. When the nervous system is on high alert, the mind starts scanning for reasons. It asks, why do I feel like this? And if it can't find a clear answer, it creates one. That's when anxiety becomes self-reinforcing. A sensation turns into a thought. The thought creates more sensation. The loop tightens. And suddenly you're anxious about being anxious, which is why people often say, I don't even know what I'm anxious about. Because the anxiety didn't start as a thought. It started as a bodily state. The mind just joined later, trying to make sense of it. And this is where compassion matters. Because if anxiety is a nervous system response, not a personal failure, then the question changes. It's no longer, what's wrong with me? It becomes, what has my system been living through?
Exactly.
Long-term uncertainty, pressure without recovery, emotional suppression, social comparison, economic instability, constant stimulation. None of this is neutral to the body, even if we've learned to function inside it. So when people say, I have no reason to be anxious, I gently want to challenge that. Maybe there isn't a single dramatic event, but there might be 1,000 small, unprocessed signals telling the body that life isn't predictable right now. And anxiety is the body saying, I don't feel safe enough to relax. Not because you're weak, but because your system is trying to protect you with the only language it has. Which reframes everything. Anxiety isn't your enemy. It's not a malfunction. It's a message, often poorly timed, overly intense, but rooted in care. Your body preparing you to run from a lion. Even when the lion is an email, a silence, or a future you can't predict. And once you see that, the goal isn't to silence anxiety completely. It's to help the system feel safe enough to stand down. And that opens the door to a much deeper conversation. Not just about anxiety as a general state, but about the different ways it shows up, depending on the fears we carry, the lives we live, and the worlds we're navigating. Because anxiety isn't one thing. It has many faces. And understanding those faces is often the first real relief people feel. And there's another layer to this that people rarely hear explained in a way that actually helps, the psychological side. Because anxiety isn't really about fear in the moment. It's about anticipation. It lives in the almost, the what if, the future that hasn't happened yet but already feels heavy in the body. That's such a key distinction. Fear is usually tied to something concrete and present. Anxiety is more abstract. It's the mind projecting forward, trying to predict, trying to prevent pain before it arrives. And the body reacts as if that imagined future is already here. Which is why anxiety can feel so exhausting. You're not responding to what's happening. You're responding to what might happen, over and over again. And the nervous system doesn't know the difference between a real threat and a vividly imagined one. So the thoughts start feeding the body. The body feeds the thoughts. A tight chest makes the mind scan for danger. The mind finds a possibility. That possibility tightens the chest even more. And suddenly you're inside a loop that feels very real, very convincing, and very hard to step out of. And then comes avoidance, which makes so much sense. If something triggers that loop, a conversation, a place, a responsibility, a feeling, the system learns very quickly, avoid this, feel better. And in the short term, it works. That relief can feel like proof. Like, see, that thing really was dangerous. But what actually happened is that the nervous system never learned it could survive the experience. So the fear stays unchallenged. It grows quieter maybe, but also stronger. Avoidance becomes the trap. Life slowly shrinks around the anxiety. Not because the person is weak, but because their system is trying to reduce overwhelm in the only way it knows how. Which brings us back to something important we need to say clearly. Anxiety is not weakness. It's sensitivity without rest. It's a nervous system that's been asked to stay alert for too long without enough safety, recovery, or reassurance. It's a system doing its job too well, detecting patterns, anticipating outcomes, caring deeply about consequences. And without balance, without pauses, without grounding, that strength turns inward. So instead of asking, "Why can't I handle this?" a kinder question might be, "What has my system been handling for a very long time?" Because when you understand anxiety this way, the response shifts from self-judgment to curiosity, from forcing calm to creating conditions where calm becomes possible. And that's where things start to change. Not by fighting anxiety, but by learning how to listen to it without letting it run your life. So if we stay with this understanding anxiety as a system that's been on for too long, I keep thinking about the kind of anxiety that doesn't come in spikes or panic moments, but just lives with you. The kind that's always there in the background. How would you describe that? That's usually what people mean when they talk about generalized anxiety, even if they never use that term. It feels less like fear and more like constant mental activity. A low hum of worry that never fully turns off. You wake up with it. You fall asleep with it. And in between, your mind is always scanning, planning, correcting, anticipating. It's the overthinking, right? The rehearsing conversations. The imagining worst-case scenarios. The feeling that if you stop thinking for even a moment, something will slip through the cracks.
Exactly.
And there's often this deep difficulty relaxing, not because the person doesn't want rest, but because rest feels unfamiliar. Silence feels loud. Stillness feels unsafe. So the mind keeps itself busy, almost like a form of self-protection. What makes it tricky is that there's usually no obvious trigger. Nothing dramatic happened today. Life might even look stable from the outside. And that makes people doubt themselves. Yes. They think, why am I anxious? Nothing is wrong. And because there's no single cause, the anxiety gets mistaken for personality. Being responsible. Being prepared. Being the one who thinks ahead. Which society often rewards. We praise people for being vigilant, organized, always on top of things. So the anxiety hides in plain sight. And underneath that, there are usually deeper roots. Chronic uncertainty, growing up or living in environments where things felt unpredictable. Perfectionism, where mistakes didn't feel safe, only performance did. Early emotional environments where you had to stay alert to moods, needs, or unspoken expectations. So the nervous system learned early, stay ready, stay ahead. Don't relax too much, because something might happen. And over time, thoughts become identified as truth. Every worry feels meaningful. Every scenario feels worth analyzing. The person doesn't just have thoughts, they are their thoughts. That's when the cost shows up. Decision fatigue from constantly weighing outcomes. Burnout from carrying mental responsibility all the time. Emotional numbness, because when your system is always tense, it doesn't have much space left to feel joy. And the saddest part is that many people don't even realize they're exhausted. They just feel flat, or irritable, or disconnected. They think this is adulthood, or ambition, or who they are now. But it's really a system that hasn't been allowed to rest. A mind that's been working overtime for years. And that's why this line keeps coming back to me. When worry becomes your personality, rest starts to feel unsafe. Not because rest is dangerous, but because your system forgot how to be without tension. Which is such an important thing to name. Because once you see that, anxiety stops being a personal flaw and starts becoming something understandable. Something that can be met slowly with care instead of pressure. Listening to this, I keep thinking about how that constant background anxiety doesn't just stay inside your head. It starts to shape how you show up with people. Or how you don't show up. Yes. And that's where social anxiety often lives. Not as a fear of people themselves, but as a fear of being seen by them. truly seen. It's the moment your awareness turns inward and becomes almost painfully sharp. Every word you say, every movement, every silence feels loaded with meaning. It's that hyper-awareness of the self. You're not in the room anymore. You're watching yourself in the room. Monitoring, correcting, adjusting. Exactly. And it can look like introversion from the outside. People say, "I'm just not social," or "I prefer being alone." And sometimes that's true, but other times, it's avoidance wearing a socially acceptable label. Because the desire for connection is still there. It just gets overridden by the fear of judgment, the fear of saying the wrong thing, of being awkward, of being misunderstood, or of being rejected, even in subtle ways. A look, a pause, someone not responding the way you hoped. For people with social anxiety, those moments don't pass through the system lightly. They land deep and replay later. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who always finds a reason not to come to gatherings. She'll say she's tired, or busy, or not in the mood, and sometimes she is. But I remember her once telling me she actually sits at home wishing she'd gone, imagining the conversations she might have had. That's such a common experience. Wanting closeness, but fearing exposure. Longing to belong, but protecting yourself from the risk that comes with being visible. And when you trace it back, there's often shame there. Or past rejection. Moments when being yourself led to embarrassment, criticism, or exclusion. Add to that a performance culture, where you're expected to be confident, interesting, articulate, and social spaces start to feel like stages instead of places of connection. And social media doesn't help. Constant comparison. Curated versions of people being effortlessly charming, always included, always liked. So the nervous system learns, visibility equals danger. Not consciously, but emotionally. And once that belief settles in, the body reacts before the mind can reason with it. Which is why this feels important to say. Social anxiety isn't about people. It's about what you learned might happen if you're fully yourself. Yes, it's a protection strategy. One that made sense at some point. Even if now, it's costing you connection. There's another layer of anxiety that people often don't talk about openly. Partly because it's so intense and partly because it's terrifying when it happens. Panic, health anxiety, situational anxiety. These are the forms that make people feel like something is seriously wrong, even when nothing visibly is. I think these are the moments when anxiety stops feeling abstract and starts feeling physical. Like your body has taken over the conversation without asking for permission. That's a good way to put it. Panic anxiety, especially, feels sudden and overwhelming. One moment you're fine, and the next your heart is racing, your chest feels tight, your breath feels strange, your vision might blur. And the mind immediately jumps to the worst possible conclusion. I'm losing control. I'm in danger. Something is about to happen. And what makes panic so cruel is that the sensations themselves feel like proof. It's not just a thought, it's your body screaming. Exactly. Panic attacks are often the result of misinterpreted physical sensations. A normal increase in heart rate, a shallow breath, a moment of dizziness, and the brain reads it as a threat. Then the fear amplifies the sensation, and the sensation amplifies the fear. It becomes a loop. I remember someone telling me I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of going crazy. That feeling of losing control over your own body is deeply destabilizing. And yet, this is important. Panic is not danger. It feels like danger, but it isn't. It's a false alarm from a nervous system that's become hypersensitive. A system that's been under stress for too long and has forgotten how to stand down. That distinction alone can be relieving. Not easy, but relieving. Because it reframes panic from something mysterious and catastrophic into something human. Then there's health anxiety, which often overlaps with panic. This constant scanning of the body. Every sensation becomes suspicious. A headache isn't just a headache, it's a sign. A flutter in the chest becomes a looming catastrophe. It's like living in permanent investigation mode. Your body stops being a home and starts feeling like a crime scene. Yes. And the irony is that the more you monitor the body, the louder it becomes. Anxiety heightens bodily awareness. Muscles tense. Digestion changes. breathing shifts. So the very act of checking creates more sensations to worry about. And reassurance doesn't last. You can get a test, hear you're fine, and for a moment there's relief. But then a new sensation appears. And the cycle restarts. Because the real fear isn't illness. It's uncertainty. Not knowing. Not being in control. Health anxiety is often about the terror of unpredictability projected onto the body. And then there's situational anxiety, which feels different again. It doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from change. Transitions. Loss. Grief. Big life shifts. Moving. Ending a relationship. Becoming a parent. Losing someone. Starting over. Even positive changes can destabilize the nervous system because they remove what was familiar. It's like the ground moves, and your body reacts before your mind can catch up. Even when you intellectually understand what's happening. Situational anxiety is the nervous system saying, I don't recognize this terrain yet. It's not pathology, it's adaptation in progress. But when we don't give it space, when we judge ourselves for not being okay fast enough, it can harden into something chronic. What I'm hearing across all of these, panic, health anxiety, situational anxiety, is that the body keeps getting misunderstood. Yes. And that misunderstanding creates fear. So maybe the most important reframe here is this. The body is not your enemy. Sensation is not catastrophe. Panic is not proof that something terrible is happening. It's proof that something inside you is asking for safety, for slowing down, for reassurance that you're not under attack, even if it feels like you are. And when we stop fighting the sensations, when we stop treating them like threats, something begins to soften. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually, which feels like a good place to pause. Because anxiety isn't just about fear. It's about how we respond to fear. And that's where change actually begins. When you step far enough back, anxiety stops looking like an individual problem and starts looking like a cultural one. Because yes, people feel anxious, but look at the environment we're asking nervous systems to survive in. Always on, always reachable, always behind. It's not neutral. It's demanding. I keep thinking about how many people say, I don't know what I'm anxious about. And maybe that's because it's not one thing. It's the water we're swimming in. Exactly. We live inside anxious systems. Systems that reward urgency, speed, constant visibility. Systems where productivity has quietly become a measure of worth. If you're resting, you're lazy. If you're not progressing, you're failing. If you're not optimizing, you're falling behind. And your nervous system hears all of that as pressure, not motivation. It hears, stay alert, don't slow down, something might go wrong if you do. That's where this low-level anxiety comes from. The background hum so many people describe. Not panic, not crisis, just constant tension. A sense that you should be doing more, being more, responding faster. Even rest has become performative. You don't just rest. You recover efficiently. You track your sleep. You optimize your morning routine. You turn rest into another task to complete correctly. And if you don't feel better afterward, you assume you've failed at resting too. Which is heartbreaking, because rest is supposed to be permission, not achievement. There's also something about digital life that feels important here. Our nervous systems were not designed to process this much information, comparison, and emotional stimulation all day, every day. We've created digital nervous systems outside our bodies. Notifications, feeds, messages, updates, they keep us in a constant state of micro-alert. Not enough to run, but enough to never fully settle. And comparison is baked into it. You don't just live your life, you watch everyone else living theirs, edited, curated, accelerated. Which quietly tells your nervous system, you're late, you're behind, you're missing something. That's why reassurance doesn't work the way it used to. Telling someone you're doing fine doesn't land when the entire environment is whispering the opposite. When systems, algorithms, and expectations are constantly escalating. So anxiety becomes personalized. People think there must be something wrong with me instead of asking, what am I responding to? And that's the provocative part. We treat anxiety like a personal flaw, something to fix, manage, eliminate, but we rarely question the structures that generate it. the lack of collective safety, the absence of shared pauses, the way uncertainty is handled individually instead of together. There's very little room to be human slowly anymore. To not know, to not be okay, to fall behind without feeling like you're disappearing. And when safety becomes conditional, earned through productivity, success, or resilience, anxiety makes sense. The nervous system stays alert because safety feels fragile, which explains why so many people feel exhausted and anxious at the same time. Tired, but unable to rest. Longing for relief, but afraid to stop. That's not weakness. That's adaptation to an anxious world. The problem isn't that people can't cope, it's that they're coping alone, inside systems that never power down. So maybe the question isn't, why am I anxious? Maybe it's, what am I being asked to carry that was never meant to be carried by one nervous system? And once you see anxiety this way, not just as something inside you, but something between you and the world, compassion becomes possible. And from compassion, change has somewhere to start. So when we talk about coping, I want to be careful with that word. Because so often it sounds like, here's how to stop feeling what you're feeling. And after everything we've just said, that doesn't feel honest. Yes, coping isn't about eliminating anxiety. It's about changing your relationship to it. And that already removes so much pressure. Because the nervous system doesn't calm down when it's being judged or rushed. It calms down when it feels accompanied. Maybe it helps to start with what doesn't work, because so many people are exhausted from trying the wrong things and blaming themselves when they fail. Forcing positivity is one of the biggest ones. Telling yourself everything is fine when your body clearly doesn't agree. The nervous system hears that as dismissal, not reassurance. It actually increases anxiety because now you're unsafe and misunderstood by yourself. Overthinking anxiety is another trap. Analyzing it endlessly, researching symptoms, trying to understand it perfectly before allowing it to pass. It feels productive, but it keeps the system activated. You're still circling the threat. And avoidance dressed up as self-care. Canceling everything. Shrinking your life. Calling it protecting your peace, when really it's fear deciding for you. Short term, it brings relief. Long term, it teaches your nervous system that the world is dangerous and you are fragile. There's also the quiet shame. Getting frustrated with yourself for not calming down fast enough. Thinking I should be over this by now. But shame is not a regulator, it's an accelerant. What psychology actually supports is much gentler and much braver. Regulation over control. Listening over fixing. Building capacity instead of demanding calm. Nervous system regulation isn't about stopping thoughts. It's about helping the body feel safe enough for thoughts to slow down on their own. That's why naming sensations matters. Instead of I'm panicking, saying my chest feels tight, my breath is shallow, my heart is fast. You're shifting from threat story to present moment awareness. The body feels met, not overwhelmed. And tolerance for discomfort, that's such a key piece. Anxiety fades not when you fight it, but when you learn you can survive it. That you can feel it rise, peak, and fall without needing to escape. Small exposures matter here. Not dramatic leaps. Tiny acts of staying. One extra minute in the room. One honest conversation. One step into uncertainty. Each time, the nervous system learns, this is uncomfortable, but not dangerous. Compassion without urgency might be the hardest one. Sitting with anxiety without needing it to go away. Saying, you can be here and I can still live my life. That's trust being rebuilt. And practically, very practically, rhythm helps. Slow, steady breathing. Not deep, not forced. Just longer exhales than inhales. It tells the nervous system there's no immediate threat. Letting anxiety exist without solving it. Not every sensation needs an answer. Sometimes the most regulating thing you can do is stop asking why and start asking, what do I need right now? Often the answer isn't dramatic. Water, movement, warmth, fewer inputs, less optimization, turning down the volume instead of adding another technique. Because healing anxiety isn't about mastering life. It's about trusting yourself inside life, even when it's uncertain, even when it's uncomfortable. You don't calm anxiety by controlling life. You calm it by trusting yourself to handle life. I think this is the part where all of the understanding we've shared either stays theoretical or becomes human. Because anxiety doesn't live in concepts. It lives in moments, in choices we make quietly, in the ways our lives slowly bend around what feels safe.
Yes.
And for me, naming anxiety was not dramatic. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a slow realization that I was organizing my life around staying ahead of discomfort, choosing the predictable option, over-preparing, leaving early, saying no before anyone could ask too much of me. I relate to that so deeply. For a long time, I thought I was just being responsible, thoughtful, low maintenance. But underneath it, there was a constant calculation. How do I avoid feeling overwhelmed? And that question quietly shaped my days. I remember a friend, someone incredibly capable, who always seemed calm. Everyone admired how composed she was. But one night she told me she was exhausted from holding herself together. That her calm wasn't peace, it was vigilance. Anxiety had taught her how to look fine. That's such a familiar story. Anxiety doesn't always make you fall apart. Sometimes it makes you high-functioning. It makes you dependable. It makes you invisible in your struggle. And that invisibility can be so lonely. What changed for me wasn't getting rid of anxiety. It was understanding it, realizing that my body wasn't betraying me, it was trying to protect me with the tools it had learned early on. There was relief in that. Not relief as in I'm cured, but relief as in I'm not broken. The moment anxiety had a name, it stopped being a personal failure and became a shared human experience. And with that naming came softness. Less self-judgment, more curiosity. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" I started asking, "What am I responding to? What feels unsafe right now?" Learning coexistence was the real shift. Anxiety still shows up. Before big conversations. During uncertainty. In quiet moments when the future feels foggy. But it doesn't run the room anymore.
Exactly.
It's more like a background voice now, one I acknowledge without obeying. I've learned that I can carry anxiety and still choose connection, creativity, rest. The fear doesn't disappear, but it loosens its grip. And maybe that's the most honest promise we can make here. Not that anxiety will vanish, but that life can expand again. That you can stop organizing your entire existence around not feeling something. Living with anxiety isn't about becoming fearless. It's about becoming kinder to the part of you that's afraid, and letting the rest of you keep living. I keep thinking about something we've been circling around this whole time, that anxiety, for all the pain it brings, is still a response. It's not a verdict on who you are. It's not proof that something is wrong with you. It's your system saying, something matters here.
Yes.
Anxiety gets framed as an enemy so quickly. As something to eliminate, manage, defeat. But when you sit with it long enough, really sit with it, you start to hear the intelligence inside it.
The care.
The sensitivity. The attempt to protect a life that feels fragile or important. And when we label it as a sentence, "This is just how I am," "This will always ruin things," we close the conversation. But when we see it as a signal, the conversation opens. A signal doesn't mean danger forever. It means attention is needed. I think that's where a lot of relief can begin. Not in calming down. Not in forcing reassurance. But in realizing you're responding to a world, a history, a pace of life that is genuinely intense. Of course, your nervous system has something to say. So maybe the invitation isn't to become less anxious. Maybe it's to become more honest about what your life is asking of you. About what feels misaligned. About where you're pushing through when something in you is asking to slow down. That's why I love the idea of listening more closely instead of fixing faster. Anxiety doesn't always need action. Sometimes it needs presence. Sometimes it needs you to stay instead of escaping the moment. If you take anything from this conversation, let it be something gentle. Today or sometime soon, notice one anxious moment. Just one. Don't analyze it. Don't correct it. Don't try to make it go away. Stay with it for a breath or two. Feel where it lives in your body. Notice what it's protecting. And remind yourself, quietly, I'm allowed to be here with this. You're not broken. You're not failing at life. You're responding with a nervous system that learned how to survive. They both fall silent. No music, no rush, just space and breath.